All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Town of Grafton Select Board, Finance Committee, School Committee joint meeting here at 7:03 p.m. As a preliminary matter, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Peter Carlson. I'm the chair of the Town of Grafton Select Board, and permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on this agenda can hear me. And when I read your name, please confirm in the affirmative that you can hear me. Ms. DeFazio had indicated to me that she will not be able to join tonight, but next up, can I have Ms. Roy?
Roy here.
Mr. Prisby?
Prisby here.
Okay, and then for town staff, I've got Carter Terenzini, temporary town administrator.
Present.
Thank you. And along with me here, I have finance committee members. When I please read your name, please answer in the affirmative. Ms. Robbins?
Miss Robbins here.
Mr. Kusher?
Mr. Kusher here.
Mr. Smith?
Barry Smith here.
Ms. McHugh?
Heather here. McHugh here.
Mr. Jefferson?
Jefferson here.
Ms. Hool?
Irene Hool here.
Mr. Swenson? Mr. Shinoy?
Shanoy here.
And Finance Committee staff member Susan Fiacco?
I am here.
Thank you. And if you would, Laura, I will just announce the school committee members, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Often, Chair of School Committee.
Laura here.
Ms. Spinney,
Here.
Ms. Marr.
Mar here.
We have Ms.
Janet
Connolly?
Rowe.
John Connolly here.
And Mr. Rathi.
Ronald Ruddy here.
Thank you. And school department staff, Superintendent of Schools, Dr. James Cumming.
Jay Cummings here.
And do we have, oh yes, and school business manager, I'm sorry, did I get that right? Business
Finance
manager?
Director.
Finance director, thank you. Miss Anita Patel.
Present.
Thank you, okay. All right. Good evening. This open meeting of the Town of Grafton Select Board, Finance Committee, and School Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirements of open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted on the town's website at www.grafton-ma.gov, allows the public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will not feature any public comment for this evening. For this meeting, the Select Board, Finance Committee, and School Committee is convening via Zoom meeting, as posted on the town's website, identifying how public may join. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and that some attendees participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you, and that take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording and viewed by the public. All supporting materials have been provided to members of this body are available on the town's website and when final minutes are posted, unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless I or any of the other chairs note otherwise. Just some ground rules, please. We are now turning to, before we turn to the first agenda of the meeting, and before we do so, please permit me to just remind everyone to please make sure you have your name, first and last name on your Zoom meeting. In addition, please ask to have the floor before speaking so we can make sure we can all hear each other throughout the meeting. So I think that's all I have for that. And before we turn to our first meeting here, so welcome everyone to our Tri-Comm Committee meeting. Let me just pull up the right thing here. Here we go. And this evening, I would like to schedule the review draft of the FY22 revenue projections. This evening, we have Mr. Terenzini, temporary town administrator, who is going to go over that. Carter?
Good evening. The process that I follow is to prepare a draft set of estimates. I'll go through with you shortly how I get to those, to distribute that to the select board, and tomorrow that will go out to the finance committee as well, and to the superintendent. I'll send you the live Excel spreadsheet as well, so you can do any what ifs you want. You can look at the formulas that we used, and please catch any mistakes that we made. Having some extra proofreading is always very helpful. This revenue estimate will be reviewing at some length with the select board at their workshop of November 10. And I have given to Mr. Haddad a number of dates that I could be available in this month to review at length with the finance committee, answer your questions, make any appropriate adjustments based upon questions from any of the three bodies, and then present to the select board. The plan of the moment is to have it on their agenda of December 1 for approval, acceptance, changing. Basically, once I get a number, that is the number that I build a budget to. The wild card obviously will be state aid. So we have a spreadsheet we'll put up here, and then I'll walk you through briefly how I get to it. It's not horribly complicated. It's not a horribly, strike that. I was going to say it's not a large budget, but it is a very large budget for many folks. But I think you'll see there's some simplicity to the approach that I use. So Peter, if you could put that one spreadsheet up, please.
Did everybody see that okay?
The first line is your personal property and real estate taxes. FY 16 through 20 are actual collections. FY 21 are just estimates at this point. Your new growth and then the override. So for the personal property and real estate tax, we simply use what your levy was this year, based in inclusive of the override that you brought in, and we get 43,164,000 when you add the 2.5%. For new growth, I take 5 years of actual receipts. I throw out the high, I throw out the low, I divide the middle three numbers by 3. And that's what I mean when I say it's relatively simplistic and straightforward. I then adjust numbers up or down a little bit based upon what I think is going on within the community and what I think is going to go on in the economy at large. So if you follow that formula, you can see you had 420 in 16, 546 in 17, 718 in 18. That's a nice coincidence. 609 in 19 and 893 in 20. The estimate subject to DOR approving the recap sheet is 913, 245. So I always work with those 5 trailing years. I take, in this instance, take the FY 20, 893, I throw it out. I take the FY 16 of 420,000, I throw it out. Tally up 17, 18, and 19 divided by 3. That gives me 624,000. My initial estimate was 600. However, your assessors was substantially lower at 500. And in the interest of harmony in the family, I just split the difference between my 600 and her 500. Nothing much more complicated than that. For the override, you had 3.2 million. My understanding is, and I've heard different numbers of bringing it in over 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years. So I use the most conservative, which is to bring it in over 5 years. I took 3.2 million, which was that portion of the override assigned to what I'm going to call general government. You used 863,000. So I took the remainder, divided it by 4, and I'm assuming that you'll bring $575,000 out of that override into this budget each year over the next 4 years. And there'll be some final rounding in the end. Debt exclusion is pretty straightforward. You tally up what is going to be on a form called your DE1. That is to say the principal and interest on debt that you have excluded. That's where the DE comes from. And if you have an expense, you have an income. Moving down, motor vehicle excise, other excise, local options, penalty and interest on taxes, basically everything from lines 3 through 15, even 16 are basically the same rule, what I call the 3-year rule. Take those actual 5 years, throw out the high, throw out the low, average them. That's the projection. And then I'm very anal. That's why everything's going to end in a round number. Sorry, it's a little bit of OCD in me that I will admit to right up front. And then I tweak numbers up or down a little bit. Meals tax is actually holding up surprisingly well. I have the same experience in another community. Could that change? I suppose it could. But given that last year you had 157, 158, I'm not sure that 145, based upon current trends, is going to be all that far off. And obviously the Finance Committee will have questions, and the Select Board will have questions, and we'll make adjustments as appropriate. 2 items of note: the miscellaneous non-recurring. I've got to get behind that to find out exactly what is in there. The 3-year rule would say 150. I'm struggling to believe that you can generate that on a consistent basis. So I brought it down to 100. On the Medicaid funds, the 3-year rule would say about 196. I did have a conversation with Ms. Patel. We know that Medicaid in general is coming down in some of the other school districts that I've worked with. We also know that the students aren't in school. And if you aren't giving services, you're not going to get reimbursement for it. And I believe that Ms. Patel and I were within $5,000 of each other, if I remember our conversation correctly. A couple wild cards, way too early to tell, but I have to make some sort of estimate. The state this year has made a commitment to hold FY21 revenues distributed to municipalities at the FY20 levels. I have assumed that between that commitment continuing, the Student Opportunity Act that the state made such a commitment to perhaps less than 18 months ago, the superintendent could speak to the adoption of that far better than I. And a hoped for transfusion from the federal government, we have made an initial assumption that the state will hold those revenues flat. You're going to see some notes in that far right column because after talking with the town treasurer, with Ms. Patel and others, chairman of the Finance Committee, we're thinking that some of these items are kind of double counted in the budget, the way that the accounting is currently done. So we're going to separate the sewer fund out completely, have it as a standalone budget adoption. And we're going to have the debt paid simply out of the sewer fund, as opposed to first paying it out of the town fund, sending a bill to the sewer fund, having the sewer fund send a reimbursement check back to the town. So there's going to be some minor tweaking, but I've left it as it is for right now, so you can see a head-to-head comparison. If my projections, if my math is all correct, and thank you very much to Amy Perkins for working on this with me and for me, and Ms. Patel for taking a few moments to share some numbers and share some thoughts. You're going to have approximately $1.4 million in new revenues next year. I will distribute the entire live document in the next couple of days. We did not try to tackle the actual detail account by account by account. We'll get the actuals filled in over some time when staff time permits, but I think you can see that fairly simplistically. Peter, if you think there's value, you can put the memo up on the screen, but I think I've described it probably fairly well. Happy to answer any questions, but this is the first blush that we can give you. I mean, as I say, the real wild card in all this, I'm pretty comfortable with everything from line 16 and above, but line 17 and 18, as you can imagine, especially for those of you who went for the 03 or the 08 downturns, they just remain open wild cards at this moment. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Do you want that memo up now and read that?
If you think it would add some value, sure. So this really just kind of reduces to writing what I've said on the real estate tax, the new growth, the 3-year rule, the difference between myself and the assessor, the override, how I picked that number of 575 to make an assumption that's brought in, codes 3 to 15, and Medicaid. Thank you, Peter.
Welcome. All right, any questions? Anyone want to open up?
And this will, if I might say, Peter, will be presented to the select board. They'll have it with their package. We'll take it up in their workshop. They'll have it for a couple of weeks. Finance committee will have it by Monday. They'll have a couple of weeks with it, school staff, school committee. I would hope to have any questions, comments, and concerns within roughly 3 weeks that I might finalize a final draft for submission to the select board for their business meeting of 1 December.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Prisby?
No, I think with that in mind, I'm just going to go through the memos and have some more intelligent questions and comments for the workshop.
Okay. Anybody else? Any questions? Mr. Smith?
Yeah, a small question about the sewer enterprise fund. My understanding is that, yes, it's an enterprise fund, so whatever fees they collect technically stay within the enterprise fund. However, the DPW director is paid out of the enterprise fund for some time working for the sewer department, but he also works for the DPW. So how is that going to work?
Well, there's 2 ways to do it, and different municipalities do it differently. In some municipalities, and to some degree, my understanding is that you pay the expenses, certain expenses, particularly the debt, that's the big driving number, out of the general fund. Then you bill the enterprise fund for that debt payment that you've made. Then the sewer fund, they don't necessarily cut a check. It's probably just a journal entry, and Ms. Patel could tell us better. And then that journal entry or that check is done, and the sewer, transfers from enterprise funds are credited with that amount. The adjustment that we're looking at making is a little bit cleaner. When the debt bill comes in, it's simply going to be paid out of the sewer enterprise fund, because what you're doing is you're ballooning to some degree your expense budget and your revenue budget. It's additional accounting transactions. And every time you have to add an accounting transaction, you are A, adding some time, and B, adding potential for error. So Ms. Perkins and Ms. Patel and I have been discussing, okay, so which of these, if any, can we simply charge directly to the sewer fund and not have all these transfers back and forth? But for the moment, we've left it as you have seen the revenues in the past. So I can give you that good, clean 1.4 million comparison side by side. If I had pulled that debt out of there, it would have looked like you're actually going down in net revenues.
All right.
Any other questions? Ms. Hoffman?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Carter, for this presentation. It's great to see the numbers so early. How are you thinking that we should plan for COVID in 2022? I know with us on the school side, it's a challenge because we don't quite know what our school is going to look like, and we don't know if we're going to get increased CARES Act funding. So do you have any recommendations for us?
Well, that's a challenge. It's something I know the superintendent and I chatted for a few minutes about the other day. For the moment, I'm going to make, and let me say that I haven't gotten to the expense side of the budget just yet. Those are all coming in. But for the moment, from the general fund side of the house, I'm going to assume that on June 30, 2021, COVID's gone in terms of planning.
Okay.
I may modify that adjustment between now and when I release the budget and think, no, it's really the second quarter of the fiscal year, or it's the third quarter of the fiscal year, and look to see what impacts that would mean we have to carry through Q1 and Q2. But as I sit here tonight, that is the sense of direction that I have. We do not have the same kinds of impacts as you do. Yes, we have some PPE issues. We have the issue of the receptionist at the front desk. And thank you to Ms. Patel for her work with us on the CARES and the FEMA monies. We don't have the same kind of impacts as you have. So I'm not sure that me making that assumption on the general fund side is necessarily going to impact the budget all that much.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other question? Anyone else have a question? Mr. Often.
Thanks. Yeah, just one comment, I guess. I like the way that you're thinking in terms of your assumptions and the way that you're getting to the numbers. One of the things that might occur in terms of upside, excuse me, this year is we may have some cannabis revenue coming online. So that's something to consider, and maybe we can talk about that in our workshop.
We can. You had a $90,000 estimate in FY21 based upon the HCAs that you have in place. You're probably only going to realize about 65,000. You have provisional licensure for one of your operations. That came in about 2 months ago, pretty much around the time I was coming on board, if I recall correctly. It can take upwards of 1 year of getting final licensure. So for the moment, I've made an assumption that you will only have about 65,000 in cannabis revenues in FY22, replacing that 65,000 you got in flat fee payments out of that HCA. Truthfully, I would have to see the business plan. I just have no idea what we would estimate. I don't, frankly, have a lot of experience with it. And those retailers that are out there, you know, when Northampton and Leicester and some of the others initially opened, they were doing $10,000, $15,000 a day. Every time a new retailer comes online, that's flattening out. So we'll have to talk about that at some length. I'm not sure. I think you're too early in the ball game, frankly, to start to take that into your revenue stream in any serious amount of money, man.
That's refreshing to hear, actually. Thanks.
I would agree. Any other question?
And again, these documents will be all sent out. The Excel spreadsheets will be sent out as live files. And any questions, if I can get them about 3 weeks out, would be very much appreciated. And if you find a math error, please don't blame Amy or anybody else. Just let me know and we'll get it fixed.
All right, appreciate that, Carter. Thanks for the presentation. And I know this is difficult to do in these times or uncertainties, but I think the earlier we get these numbers, the better it is. I think we can plan. But I want to say thank you very much for taking the time and going through this. Okay. So next up on the agenda is after this, we were going to talk about budget discussion with the school committee and finance committee for FY22. So this is just an open agenda item for discussion between the three boards. Does anyone want to go first? Laura wants to raise her hand, but she's not. I'm just kidding. All right, so I guess I'll start. So after seeing your projections, I guess the big concern that I'm hearing just from the one question was really about, how does the schools anticipate or plan for revenue needed to deal with COVID-19 for next fiscal year? So I know, Carter, you gave a response to that it would be, challenging really to make any assumptions now, but I don't know if the school department or Jay or Anita can maybe enlighten us a bit and just kind of maybe share like what are some of the concerns that the school department is running into or they're thinking that they may have to contend with.
I wish I had a great answer for this, Peter. We certainly struggled with even thinking about how to approach FY22. Obviously, pretending, we can hope, but let's pretend that COVID goes away on, end of June 21, then it's straightforward, easy, etc. We don't even know right now, the majority of the funding that's COVID related sunsets at the end of December. So we're not even sure what we're going to look like in January, never mind in FY22. So I think I can speak for Anita and possibly the board when I say that we're certainly open to any approach, any insights, any guidance that anybody here tonight has in terms of how we move forward. If COVID is still with us next year, obviously there is a 0% chance that the town alone could fund what is needed to run schools, if you will.
So I guess given with that contingency, I think that's a great point, Jay. Thank you for that. Mr. Shenoy?
Did you say Shenoy?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I was just thinking about a question, both for Carter and Mr. Cummings. What are other towns, how are they planning for this? Means, have we talked to other towns to get an idea of what they might be doing?
This is Jay Cummings, speaking from the school side. I've spoken just this past week with about 20 different area districts, and we're ahead of the curve in terms of even having this first discussion, which is fantastic. So people have been asking me to get back to them once we have this discussion, like we're going to figure it out tonight. And I know we're not. As soon as I get a better sense of what other districts are doing and towns are doing, I'll certainly share that. But so far, we're a little ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Wolf? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Terenzini, real quick, you want to respond? I'm sorry.
That's okay, I'll wait.
I would say that my peers that I've been talking with are pinning their hopes on the remainder of the CARES monies that will be unexpended out of the federal budget, at a minimum being extended by 9 months to a year. I don't know how realistic that is. There is a substantial amount of the first tranche of money that has not been expended both in this state and across the nation. So they're certainly hopeful on that. Everybody else just seems to be sort of not quite sure what to do. That's not a great answer. But I think that, we actually are in some ways are ahead of the curve here by having some revenue projections, having these discussions, the superintendent and I having a brief conversation, because my peers for the most part are just trying to sort out how to approach it.
Thank you. Ms. Wool, and then Mr. Smith.
Okay, so Dr. Cummings, I have two questions. The first one is about enrollments. I know some places, Brookline is one of them, have seen a significant decline in enrollments. I mean, it's not 50%, but more than 10 is going to be big for almost any district. Have we seen anything like that we have to worry about long-term, where people are like, oh, you know what, I like this homeschooling thing, or, oh God, that's it, we're running off to the private schools?
Yeah,
So that would be the one question.
We have not seen that. We've had an increase in homeschooling, for example, but we're talking about an increase of like 10 students.
Okay, so
So
not
very,
big.
very minimal, and less than that going to private.
Okay, which is good, because obviously we get per pupil money from the state. The
Right.
second thing is, are there things that we have done because of COVID that even if COVID or when COVID goes away, are going to be continued expense? For example, no one ever dreamed of giving, Chromebooks or iPads to, first graders. So now all of a sudden, virtually every district in the state has become a one-to-one district, K through 12. So do we plan to continue being a one-to-one district even after COVID? And what has that added for expense in terms of having to maintain all those instruments, planning on repairs, replacement, and anything else we've done for COVID that might continue even after COVID?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. Based on just the monies that have been spent to date for technology, we've definitely increased our number of devices. We're 1-to-1, 6 through 12, when we used to be pre-COVID 9 through 12. We actually just received a long-awaited shipment of Chromebooks today. If we did apply just 1-to-1, we'd probably be grades 4 through 12, 1-to-1 in this district once everything's settled. Some of those devices would be taken back and put back into the carts that we use in the lower elementary schools. So we wouldn't be a 1-to-1 district, but your point's a great one. We've had to add technology staff. Even after COVID, we're still going to need additional staff to support the number of devices. Short term, we should be fine in that most of the devices are new, but in a couple of years, if we don't have a refresh plan, we're going to find ourselves behind the 8 ball and with woefully outdated 1-to-1 devices. So, and that's not going to work. So there will have to be a continued investment. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you. Any other questions regarding FY22 budget discussions? Oh, Mr. Smith, thank you. Yep.
Have there been any discussions with our Blackstone Valley Tech representative?
Yes, I've talked to him.
And what I was going after was, if the 13 towns with public schools that also have Blackstone Valley Tech, the image was that the public schools were going to be taking a haircut, whereas Blackstone Valley funding, is it going up, going down, or are they also going to take a haircut?
That I don't know. I definitely don't know the BBT numbers. I can get them, but I don't have them on hand.
Any other questions about the FY22 budget discussion? All right, I'm not seeing anything. So, I appreciate this. This is extremely early to be having discussions, but I think it's going to be more important as we go along. I have a feeling that these three boards are going to be meeting a little bit more regularly this year than maybe last year, as these developments occur and as information becomes available, so we understand how each one of our boards and our based on what we make decisions on, will then be able to move forward. I'm kind of talking here a little bit more than I wanted to. But if there isn't any other questions, I think we can conclude this part of the Tri-Comm meeting, unless there is anything that we feel that we need to cover tonight before we get into some of the other parts of the agenda that really have to do with the select board and
I
finance.
just have one thing, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Brisby.
This is really early, and I know that there's a lot of concern in the community, given everybody's general fear about COVID, whether or not you're going to have a job next month, whether or not you're going to be able to make your bill payments. And, people watch these meetings to figure out whether or not the people who are running the town have their fingers on the pulse of where we're going in terms of income and where we're going in terms of expenses. And I think meetings like this are a good first step. Thank you, Carter, for being on top of everything. Since you've been here, you jumped right on board. Thank you to Jay for interacting with Carter and establishing a relationship. And thank you to FinCom and the school committee for being willing to come in on a Thursday night. And I know we all have other things to do. This was, I think, a brief meeting. We're at the introductory phase of what is going to become another 5-year post-override span. And we're going to have a lot more discussions, and we need to see our own 5-year projections and all that. But it didn't used to be this easy. Having been through quite a few Tri-Comm community meetings myself, we worked long and hard to get to a point where we would have calm, rational discussions about this. And I'm glad to see that we're off to a good start this year. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brisby. Okay. All right, I want to thank everyone for coming out. School Department, Finance Committee, and Select Board. We have a couple more things on the agenda this evening. I don't believe they pertain to anything on the school committee, but all of you are more than welcome to stick around and stay as we go through parts C and D of our agenda.
I think I will take a motion to adjourn for my school committee.
So moved.
All right. Jen Conley,
Jen Connolly, aye.
Amy Marr,
Amy Marr, aye.
Liz Spinney,
Aye.
Rahul Rati.
Aye.
All right, Laura Upton, aye. I want to echo Ed's thoughts and thank everybody for being here. I'm looking forward to working with you all. And thanks for all the hard work you do. It's really appreciated. So have a good night.
Thank you. Have a great night. Okay. So next up, we have discussion regarding HRA funding and capital stabilization funding with regards to the override. I'm going to hand this over to Mr. Terenzini, if you wanted to please just enlighten us a bit on these developments.
Sure. And Mr. Chairman, Jenny Creamer is possibly going to be able to join us when we get to the capital stabilization issue. I know you have her number. I've just emailed it to you again. I told her we would text her as we approached being ready, and hopefully she can get out of her meeting and join us for a few minutes. There are two actions that we need to consider taking at the fall town meeting, in addition to those that we're already prepared to act upon. The first is the HRA funding. The town in 2018, I'm told, changed its benefit platform in terms of some of the copays that were imposed, and for the first time, a deductible. As an inducement towards getting everyone to agree to do that, the town made a commitment to reimbursing employees for certain co-pays and portions of the deductible. The theory being that what you would save in the premiums would more than offset what you paid out in reimbursements. There is supposedly, or I'm told, I don't want to say supposedly, conversations that unfortunately did not get delivered to my desk until earlier this week, with the need for covering approximately $30,000. It actually comes in around 21,000 known at present. There's an overdraft on the account of approximately 1,000, and the statute was, I'm not going to say changed, but temporarily suspended to allow employees to submit claims for reimbursement deeper into the calendar year, and actually until the COVID emergency is declared over. These are not considered late bills because they will be do not become a liability until they're actually turned in to us with the employee's signature and date on the form. However, they are very likely going to hit within the next, well, there's $21,000 that we know of in claims that are sitting on in the school department and on HR's desk as it is. The budget did not contain that kind of money from to cover last fiscal year's bills. I have talked with both the accountant and HR about perhaps a different way to handle it in the future. You do have my apologies, but at this point, I don't see any option but to add a paragraph D. I believe it is when I worked with Joanne Duncan this afternoon. I believe it's Article 2. Peter, I don't have the warrant in front of me, but I believe Article 2 is an amendment of the FY21 budget. The line item would read health insurance dash HRA funding or HRA reimbursements, $30,000. It unfortunately would come out of free cash. Happy to answer any questions that I can answer, but that is really pretty much the limit of my knowledge, unless there's something that comes to me as you ask that question.
Thank you, Mr. Terenzini. Ms. Robbins, and then Mr. Prisby.
I would just like to have a clarification from Carter. Did you say that you were going to take this out of Article 1 because they're not late bills?
Yeah, they're not late bills because they don't become liabilities. I worked this through with the accountant this afternoon. They don't become our liability until they're dated and presented, and they've all been dated or will be dated in this current fiscal year. So the best avenue appeared to be to add to Article 2, which is the amendment of the FY21 operating budget by adding a line health insurance dash HRA, and I can't remember if I called it funding or reimbursements, $30,000.
Mr. Terenzini, just a point of clarification, Ms. Robbins, 1 minute. Article 2 is prior fiscal year bills.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have them backwards then? Is it Article 1 that's the?
Can I share the warrant out with you real quick, and that way you can.
Please do. Yes, Peter, that is where it would be. I'm sorry, I had flip-flopped Article 1 and Article 2 in my mind.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Sue, did you have any follow-up to that before we go to Mr. Prisby?
Thank you.
Okay.
My apologies.
Ed?
Yeah, I'm just concerned as ever about how we got here, whether or not this was an unanticipated cost because of additional claims that we didn't foresee and we were budgeting too low because this is something that's relatively new, or is this something we under budgeted for? How did we get to a point where we're having to make this correction in October or November?
I don't know how your budgeting was built for this. For instance, your current budgeting did not have a factor for increase in the Medicaid supplemental policy that we've written both the finance and the select board about. I'm afraid I can't comment on how we got to this number. As to how it came to be so late, I think that was simply vacancies in staff and a lack of communication. And this finally landed on my desk, I believe, Tuesday morning, Mr. Prisby. I just can't give you a better answer than that. I'm sorry.
Any other questions?
Um,
Mr. Terenzini, then Ms. Wu. Yep.
I will say that there's another way to handle this, which is to create a, if you will, a pool of monies that are on deposit with what we call a TPA, a third-party administrator. The employees submit their claims to the TPA. We never see it, thank goodness, because we certainly don't want to be responsible for somebody's medical record, becoming public by mistake somehow. And what the TPA does is, as that gets drawn down, they simply tell us it needs to be replenished. Sort of like for those of us who have easy passes, there's we have our easy pass connected to our credit card, and after we've been through enough tolls, whether it's Mass or New York, they send you an invoice, and then you carry a replenishment amount within your operating budget. I think we're going to try to look at a mild change to that for the coming fiscal year, which might address some of this issue.
Yeah, my question would be, if I was to go back and look at the FY21 budget or even the FY20 budget, should there have been a line item for this? And if there should have been, where would the most likely place for it be? In other words, where should, if I wanted to go back and figure out how we did this in the past couple of years, where would I find it? Or is that the problem? I wouldn't.
I honestly don't know. The most likely place, your unclassified budget is as things, a number of different accounts. In other towns, it probably would be in an insurance and benefits account, and we probably would carry a line item for reimbursement of co-pays based upon some experience. So for instance, in another community, we reimburse the $500 on outpatient surgeries. And we've developed a history. It's a small item, smaller community. We've developed sort of over the past 6 years, a bit of an experience rating. And again, smaller community, smaller pool. And we just carry, I think, $5,000 a year. And if it's a little bit off, there's usually whether workers' comp came in a little bit lower or replenishing the unemployment pool, something like that. That's probably where I would start looking if I had more familiarity with your budget.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sue Fiacco.
Thank you, Peter. Carter, this isn't a fiscal year situation, is it? This is a calendar year situation?
So it kind of splits.
Yeah.
Your employees are, if I understand correctly, and please bear with me, I'm still learning your operational procedures and the like. My understanding is that the employees can only submit at certain times of the year. It's not every single time that something happens. So they get through the fiscal year and then they submit the claims for that fiscal year. So let's say they had a surgery in January, they submit in July. So you're paying effectively last year's fiscal bill out of this year's fiscal year. But you can do that because it's not a liability to you until it lands on your desk with a date. I'll get you better information between now and when we present this as part of the budget.
Thank you.
So I think the important thing here tonight is around the discussion that we have to amend the article on town meeting floor for Saturday for this, right, Mr. Terenzini, to include additional monies to be transferred into the FY21 operating budget.
The only other way is we simply pay it out of that health insurance line item using the rationale that it's an offset against premiums, and you backfill it in the spring. I'm just not comfortable that there's that kind of running room in your budget and you want to wait until the spring to do that. It is an option. I don't recommend it, but I do want to make you aware of that option.
So there is that option that we could consider, that we have a special town meeting before the annual town meeting to really kind of handle any business to wrap up before the end of the fiscal year. So you're saying that could be the potential option for us?
If you have enough running room to make it until then, yes, because your advisory committee reserve is relatively lean. It's an option. I want to make you aware of it. I don't recommend it, however.
Okay. Ms. Roy?
So that could essentially be a plan B if the amendment on Saturday's town meeting did not go well. I'm just trying to clarify, is the amendment on Saturday plan A?
I would recommend to the board, it's your decision at the end of the day, that the adding this item to Article 1, bringing that 230 up to 260 truly is plan A and the best plan. And if for some meeting the meeting is not receptive to that, we'll simply have to figure out how to get these things paid. And I can tell you, you will need a backfill. However we get that figured out, you will need to backfill that in the spring, based upon what I know about the Medicaid supplement policies as well.
Ms. Roy, I've got a procedural question before we get to your next one, if you don't mind. And the reason why I bring this up is, so we have this consent agenda that we're going through on Saturday. Can we amend it unless we have to take this article out of the consent agenda and read it all on its own?
Well, you have a consent agenda, but you have a consent agenda of motions that you're going to put forward. If the Article 1 had been spelled out in your warrant to the degree it is in the motion, I would say no, you'd have to make that part of it. But I'm not seeing a problem based upon the way I read the consent agenda, which basically says, here's the motions for Articles X, Y, Z. And the consent motion is to package all those motions into one single vote. So as I read it quickly today, the motion on packaging stays the same, and we simply add this to Article 1, Peter.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Ms. Roy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go in front of you there.
No, that was actually my follow-up question. So we can amend Article 1 within the consent agenda, or would we have to, because my understanding, we would have to hold Article 1, amend it, and then go forward. Is that what you just said?
Well, remember, Article 1, from the perspective of the meeting, is to see if they will vote to amend the FY21 operating budget. Technically, that motion on that is still in your control at this point, unless I'm not understanding something that you do procedurally.
Ms. Robbins and then Mr. Kusher.
I just want to mention that what we're talking about, we're adding this to the Article 1. We're not amending the motion. We're adding this to the article. So we don't have to talk about amending the motion on town meeting floor.
That is correct. If the consent agenda was put forth, which includes all of those motions, and then you wanted to add it, you would be amending it. But at this point, You are, if you will, amending it tonight, but it's still in-house. You haven't presented it to anybody. It's not on the floor. You're simply adding this amount. And then the paperwork that's been published and will be distributed will have to be reprinted for handouts. Sorry, Sue. But that's the only way I see on doing this. Again, it's the board's decision. They can always go with Plan B. It's my responsibility to try to make you aware of the Plan B and Plan C, but I truly don't recommend it.
All right, thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to try phrasing it a little differently. There's no amendment to the motion because the motion hasn't been made yet. What we're talking about is changing our plan for the motion that we're going to make on town meeting floor. So when we go to make that motion now, we're going to include this versus our plan before tonight to not have this that we didn't know was going to happen. So that's all.
I would agree with that.
Okay. Ms. Robbins?
I know it's the select board's decision to do this, but I just want to add my 2 cents. I think we should do it the way that Carter is recommending to do it, because I think it's a cleaner way of doing it and more transparent. So that would be my suggestion.
So, Ms. Robbins, I would agree with you. I just want to know from a procedural standpoint, I've known in the past that if there had to be added language, like we found out after the fact, after everything was printed and everyone knew that this is what we're going to be talking about, that we've always done it on the town meeting floor, which I'm fine with not doing. But I would think that, if we did do that, I think the only thing we need from Finance Committee is to just have them render a new opinion based on the new information that now Article 1 is going to represent an additional $60,000 to be transferred from free cash into the FY21 budget.
What we would do is reconsider our previous vote and then just let the town meeting people know that we reconsidered and now we are recommending and that particular article. So it wouldn't be complicated at all.
Okay, great. Okay. Any other questions?
Peter?
Yes.
If I might, we're not raising it. We're not adding 60. We're adding 30.
Yeah.
We are going to 260. I think that's where you got the.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Yep, you're right. It's late. Thank you. Any other questions? Thanks for the clarification. Okay, so we don't need a vote from the board on this, Carter. We could just say we're going to do this.
I just, as long as the board, as long as I have a consensus, we'll prepare that addition tomorrow morning. We can review it during the agenda prep meeting. Joanne already has it. I just didn't want to cut it loose until I had a consensus of the board in case you wanted to go in a different direction.
Does anyone have any objections from the select board? Do we feel like we want to give him a motion and vote on it? That way he's got something codified from us, or is they don't think that's necessary?
We have to.
Yeah. Yeah, Carter didn't seem like he needed action from us. I mean, I'm more than happy to see the changes made for Saturday's town meeting.
I'm just going to ask Joanne when she does the meeting to note that there was a consensus of the board to support this approach.
Great. Okay. All right, so we got that half wrapped up for Saturday. And we have a plan of action. So just, so Irene, you're the vice chair of Finance Committee. So I would just ask that you guys on Saturday, vote to reconsider with the changes, right? Be prepared for that. Thank you. Okay. Moving on to Capital Stabilization Fund from the override that was passed in June. Carter, do you want to take it away here again, please?
I don't know if you had a chance to reach out to Jenny yet and if she's been able to join us. I did, just so that everyone knows, I did call your chair yesterday and tell him I felt like the guy that only ever calls him with bad news, and I'm hoping that I get some a winning lottery ticket or some sort of good news I could call with before I leave. You all come late, mid-January, late January, whatever it turns out to be. The override had two pieces. 3.2 million of what I'm going to call general fund. Yes, it's school side of the house and general government side of the house, and $800,000 for a capital stabilization fund. I believe that we've delivered to everybody a legal opinion, a memorandum of questions that I presented to council, a legal opinion, and a instructional guidance release from the Department of Revenue. The challenge is this: I know that you did not want to bring the 800 in this year, and that even at that, you might bring it in over a couple of years. That is not workable under the statute. The statute requires that you bring in the amount voted in the fiscal year for which it was voted, which would mean bringing the $800,000 in prior to setting this year's tax rate. To give you a sense of figures, I believe that Ms. Oliver presented a prospective tax rate the other night of $16.96. The addition of this 800,000 would raise that to $17.25. So that's most unfortunate at best. The other thing is you have to bring it in all at once. You can't bring it in incrementally. And let me use the explanation of why. And this is the same for the road fund that I'll speak to in a moment, that someone asked me if it was a safety valve. Once the voters approve the number, if it is not appropriated at the level that they approve it at, so let's say, for instance, this year, faced with this news, you decided you wanted to fund the roads at 700,000, you're going to fund the capital at 800, so you could keep the tax rate flat. You're stuck at the lower number. So if you had tried to bring the 800 in over 5 years, you can't do that. Not according to the DOR instructional guidance release, and not according to council. Now, I am not an attorney. I know I do play the part from time to time, and I know that Mr. Prisby is an attorney, and he may be able to clarify something here. Council, both your principal assessor and your town council agree with my reading of the statute. And again, we have provided that to you. So if all those folks are correct, you have a couple of options, none of which are great. Option one is to add it to the town meeting warrant. Again, I think, as Dan said, to add it to an item that was going to be brought forth anyways, in a different plan than what you had up until tonight. That does mean you have to raise the 800 all at once, and you get that tax rate of 17.25. The second option is you try a do-over. That is to say that in calendar 21, at the 21 annual town meeting, the relatively easy portion of any such proposal, you get this adopted, and then you go on the ballot box again. I'm not at all sure that it would pass as a standalone. That's a political decision for you. The third option is to hope you could get corrective special legislation. Because you do not have it on the town meeting warrant, you would have to do one of two things to try to get special legislation in. Option one would be to call another special town meeting, not a great idea this time of year. Or you would have to get the assistance of the delegation and of the governor to have the governor submit it to the legislature as a message from him. Now, the legislature is generally very receptive to what I would call curative special acts. But those generally relate to procedural issues and don't affect finance law across other communities. So for instance, let's say you have a town meeting or a special town meeting and there was something defective with the posting and the constable only had it out there for 12 days when he's really supposed to have it out there for 14. There's a special act that says notwithstanding any general or special legislation, the actions taken at the town meeting of fill in the blank by the town of fill in the blank are hereby validated. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Legislature usually hustles those through without much issue. The difference here is that you're basically would be asking the legislature to give you relief from a finance law that is intended to be administered uniformly across the Commonwealth. I think there would be some reluctance to do that. DOR would probably object simply on the basis of, hey, wait a minute, we don't want any municipality coming in here trying to tinker with the provisions of this statute, that statute, just because something went wrong. That's a risk assessment you would have to make. So the first risk assessment you would make is whether or not the governor would submit this on your behalf. The second risk assessment would become whether or not you could get the legislature to give you sort of a much broader financial relief than simply being curative of an administrative step. I raised a number of questions with council. You have the various paperwork and answers. I'm sorry, I told your chairman that perhaps you should not have hired the 4-year-old who's always asking how and why, and but we are where we're at, and I needed to bring this forth to you. I'm sorry.
I appreciate that. I know that this was, when you called me the other day, it was important that we get this out in front and deal with this. I just want to remind everyone that, when we were talking about this last year, we talked about doing this override very similar to how we did it in 2014. And the way that this language is written in question 2 on the ballot, states, and municipal capital stabilization fund of 800,000 beginning for fiscal year July 1st, 2020. So, I understand where this is coming from, but, if they're personally, I know I think all of you can agree that the way that we proposed this override was that we weren't going to utilize those funds or tax those funds in the first or maybe second year of what we consider this override. And given that was what we had expected as a result of this, of the ballot question that was done back in June. So I want to say, unless anyone disagrees with me, that that wasn't the intention, but I know we talked about this extensively for several meetings. But anyway, I think Dan, you had a question that you want to ask? Yep.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, how did we get into this position? Like, we were, we, meaning kind of just all of us generally, but primarily the select board, we're advocating for this override with the idea that this 800,000 would not be utilized in the first year because most of the advocacy for the override happened after the COVID situation began. So I just don't understand how we got through all that time and we never knew that that wasn't possible. Like, it blows my mind that we're only finding out now that we can't do that.
First, let me say that I am not an attorney. I certainly could be wrong. Town council, there's a reason there's multiple lawyers, and they can read the same statute in different ways. But her response to my questions, the instructional guidance release, the opinion of the principal assessor, all lead us in this direction. How was there no discussion of it? Truthfully, I kind of tripped across it because I was going to ask the selectmen to increase the $1.5 million for the road funds by 2.5% this year to start to address bridges. And so I dug out the instruction. I said, geez, I haven't done one of these, actually done one of these. I've read about it. I've heard about them. So I better dig out the instructional guidance release. And as I started reading it, these questions started popping into my mind, which is what led to all of my inquiries. I do not want to cast aspersions on anyone because I frankly could be wrong. And council could be wrong. There's always that possibility. I think that everybody entered into it in good faith. And I think that had you known this, you probably would have revised your plan to bring the capital stabilization in this year and then bring the 3.2 in over the next 4 years.
All right. So I've got one point I want to bring up, and this is I think this is unfortunately, the $1 million question. So in 2014, we wrote a very similar article that you see here. So I guess this question is to Ginny or Carter, that in the first part of question 2 here on the ballot, we talk about, shall the town of Grafton be allowed to assess an additional $4 million in real estate and personal property taxes for the purpose of funding schools and municipal operating budget? And in parentheses, we put $3.2 million and the municipal capital stabilization fund for $800,000 for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2020. So by that rationale, with the $800,000, are we then now liable to have to fund all $3.2 million in addition to the $800,000? Or do we potentially lose that? Because the way we did it in 2014, I just want to make sure, is the way that this article written, did we do it wrong in 2014 all the way through the last 5 years of will we use those override funds?
So I don't know if Ginny's online yet.
I'm here. I can speak to that if you want.
Yeah, I was just going to say that my understanding is that the provision we're talking about related to the capital is specific to it, not the general fund, but I would prefer that Ginny get the details of that.
Sure. So, in response to what Dan just said, it is allowed by the Division of Local Services of DOR to have one question fund 2 separate overrides. And there was no problem with that. There was no problem with the 2014 road stabilization. What actually turns out to be the problem is the decision to not add it into the tax rate at all in the first year, because the way Prop 2.5 works is you get to increase it by 2.5% times what you brought in. So if you bring in nothing, then 2.5% times nothing is nothing. So the problem wasn't the way the question was worded. There was nothing wrong with that, or splitting it up or whatever. It was just the fact that there wasn't a vote to appropriate anything for that purpose of the two-pronged question that led to the problem, when looking at how you're going to treat it in the next year. So that's the issue.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, yes.
could you just go back over that 2.5% of nothing part? I wasn't following the math there.
Sure. So the way that it works is there's the town meeting article that asked town meeting to approve the override, and that passed. But then there's a separate question that asks town meeting to appropriate something. So you don't have to appropriate the maximum, but whatever you appropriate in the first year cannot be extended beyond 2.5% what was appropriated in the next year. So say you pass an override for $1 million, but you only appropriate, town meeting only appropriates in the first year $100,000. Then in the second year, notwithstanding the fact that that the question allowed up to $1 million, since you only appropriated $100,000, you can only appropriate in the second year 100,000 times 2.5%. So you can only add 2.5% to the first year's appropriation.
But no, that's not correct. That's not how it works. The 2.5% is on the levy limit, not the appropriation. Have I been wrong about this the whole time? The 2.5% is the levy limit increase, not the appropriation increase.
Carter, did you want to address that?
Yeah, in fact, the Department of Revenue actually recommends that you do these in two very specific, separate questions because of this requirement that the stabilization fund, the difference is you have to think of this as two questions. So you had 3.2 million, question A for the general fund. That can go into the levy limit. You don't have to spend the whole thing. There's no requirement you spend the entirety of your levy limit. City of Worcester's $6, $7, $8 million below its levy limit. Some other communities are as well. But the legislation essentially requires that when you're funding a stabilization fund with the override, question 2, that you fully fund it in the first year. That's my understanding of how we got into this.
I can follow up on that, Mr. Chair. So this leads me to a question that has been bothering me, I think, since 2014, and now we can apply it to this stabilization as well. Should we have been increasing the road stabilization since 2014 by a factor of 2.5% all along? And does that 2.5% also apply to capital stabilization here? And are we leaving money on the table?
So I think the first question you're asking, Ed, is should we? I think that's a hard one to answer, right? I mean, I'm
not really though. I mean, because right now we
should do a lot of things is what I'm getting at, right? But
okay, fine. But that's semantic, Peter. What I'm asking is, are we able to increase the road stabilization account by 2.5% every year? Because as we've repeatedly noted in the past, number one, 1.5 actually doesn't get us very many good roads. If you ask anybody around town, what they complain about is the roads. And number two, are we just leaving money on the table that we didn't even know that we had the ability to raise to deal with the problem that people are complaining about, because nobody ever told us this? The same way nobody ever told us about the conversation that we're having right now about capital stabilization, because frankly, in my opinion, we were poorly served last spring about this.
Okay. Carter, yes, and then Colleen.
So the decision as to whether or not to increase it every year is a political decision, a policy decision by the select board. When you are funding a stabilization account with an override and you don't go up in any given year, you can't then double down by saying, oh, we went 4 years without doing it, so now we can go 1.025 to the power of 4. You can only go up that 2.5% in the year. So if you have a 1.5 road fund and 10 years later you decide you want to increase it, you can only go up to 37,500. Those 9 years that have passed are gone. So that's very important to remember. The second piece that's critically important to remember is that you can only go up by the amount that's appropriated, as Ms. Kramer spoke to. So let's say there's a year in which you need to do something and you decide the way you're going to give the taxpayers some relief is not to appropriate 1.5 million into roads, but to a 0.1 million. Remember, in the first year, it's the town meeting that's the appropriating authority. Every year after that, it is the select board that's the appropriating authority. So let's say that there's a decision, well, it's been a tough year. We're going to go down to 1 million. Well, that's your new ceiling. Now you can only go up 2.5% every year going forward, unless the town meeting and the election changes that. So are you leaving money on the table? Yes. I leave that to the board as to whether or not that's policy. They've clearly made that decision every year. I hope that's responsive to your question, Mr. Prisby.
Thank you. Dan?
So, like this is only more concerning because we have seriously considered reducing the road stabilization appropriation as a way to ease the burden of the override or to reduce the tax burden on the residents. That's something that we've seriously talked about and could have done without realizing that it would have permanently lowered the amount that we could appropriate. I mean, how do we get so deep into serious conversations about that without anybody knowing that?
Mr. Kusher, I've been here 70 days. I don't know the answer to that question. Mr. Kramer's pointed out the instructional guidance release. That very specific example is spelled out in great detail in the instructional guidance release. If you give the road fund a haircut, the hair does not grow back. That's the new length, and it only grows back at 2.5% a year, unless you go back to a new ballot question and the legislative body to move it back up.
And so that's only for a stabilization account funded by an override. That's not for just the general operational override for the regular operating budget.
Ginny, it's for the stabilization funding, if I'm understanding everything correctly.
Correct. The stabilization funds are treated differently.
Okay. At first, I thought we were talking about just overrides in general. So that's okay. So
No, sorry if I didn't make that distinction. I was focusing on the issue at hand, which is stabilization funds. But you're right.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Roy?
Okay, so in 2014, we did a $3.5 million override. 2 million went to schools and 1.5 went to road stabilization. If you go on the DLS dashboard, you can see that clearly marked out on the 2 PDF documents they have. When you go to look at the 2021 override, it says that there's 4 million in a general fund override and nothing in a stabilization override. So how does that affect the 3.2 that we should have raised for that? Because now it's reported as 4. And I guess that's my main question right there. It looks like even the $3.2 million override was reported incorrectly too, not just the $800,000 capital stabilization.
So, if I may, Ms. Roy, so you're saying that there's 2 different reporting. 1 and 14 showed 2 different categories. Was it the 2 plus the 1.5?
Yeah, so if you go on the DLS dashboard, which is like my favorite site ever, they show you a bunch of different reports. And in 2014, the school had the general operating budget, and that's a $2 million override. And then if you open up the other report, it shows the road stabilization. So what ours should look like this year is a $3.2 million operating budget, but it doesn't. It says a $4 million one. It was like the $800,000 capital stabilization just didn't exist. We didn't submit it to the state or anything like that. And I don't know how that plays in this either.
Thank you.
Peter, I don't know if you have the actual wording of the question, but when I took an initial look at the recap sheet, the assessors and I did discuss, they're actually in very different places on the recap sheet. She had the 4 million in the full general override, which adds to your permanent levy. The 1.5 million for the roads is below that line. And that does need to be adjusted. I don't know how your override got reported, but my understanding based upon the question is it should have been reported essentially as two questions. 3.2 general fund, 0.8 stabilization. They're reported in different sections. And we'll have to, and Ms. Kramer's ruled, in fact, that yes, for all practical purposes, they have to be treated as two separate questions. So I'll have to look at that reporting, and we know we have to make an adjustment on the recap. And if we have to go back in and amend the initial reporting, then we'll have to get that done.
Thank you. Mr. Hoffman.
Thanks. Yeah, I read that statute and the examples. I did not see any reference to a requirement that the appropriation has to happen in year one. So I'm just confused about, because I had a similar concern last year when this plan was kind of hatched. I didn't see anything that said that you had to raise that money in year one.
So in the world of DOR, there's the statute, and then there's instructional guidance releases. And there is their legal opinion as to how to implement the statute. And at the end of the day, it's the IGRs, Mr. Hopton, that control. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at the IGR 1720. But it clearly states, as Ms. Creamer has advised, that the amounts for the stabilization funds need to be raised in the year for which they were approved. Now, I don't want to lose sight of, you have a couple options. Option one is to try to get this dealt with on Saturday. Option two is to just take a mulligan and have a do-over. And option three is the special legislation approach. And during that additional time, perhaps DOR rules that its instructional guidance release was not in line with the statute, and you're all good. I have rarely seen DOR back up. Ginny, have you seen them back up on their IGRs and say,
No, I actually had a very lengthy conversation with Kathleen Colery, who for the past, I think, 35 years has been chief legal counsel or deputy legal counsel of the DLS. So I just wanted to confirm with her before I sent you, my response to your email. And it's not just a matter of having drawn a line in the sand and not wanting to retreat, but this is a longstanding, issue with respect to Prop 2.5. And I mean, I don't see any possibility that they would retreat from their IGR. So, I concur with you concerning the special legislation and the hurdles. I think that, tinkering with Prop 2.5, especially under the circumstances of this current fiscal year, is going to be a pretty hard sell. But it is also possible to, I think, to call a special town meeting should the board not want to add it to Article 1 for this Saturday. And that way there would be more opportunity to kind of inform the public about, what is being asked ahead of the vote being put to town meeting. That would have to happen before the tax rate is set, which is generally late November, early December. So, I mean, it's a tight time frame, but there's still more time, obviously, than there would be for this Saturday.
Thank you. Ms. Hool and then Mr. Prisby.
Okay, so my question is this, and maybe I just missed something, because I was trying to look at some things relative to this while we were all talking. Carter, am I hearing you correctly that you seem to feel that we have to go for the whole 800,000 now?
That is what the IGR says, and that is what Ms. Kramer has advised that
Okay,
legal
because that
counsel.
doesn't make sense, because as you were saying, and as you gave in your examples, and what I just read in that thing you provided us from DLS, we appropriate some amount in the first year, and then in subsequent years, we can ask for that amount or the increase. It doesn't say it, but the increase of 2.5%. Why are we not able to just say, okay, we figured this was going to be a 4-year process, 200 this year, 222, 223.
He's been exceeding that in the votes we have seen. So
that's my question. I'm not understanding why we can't do that, why you feel we have to go for this whole 800 at once.
You have to first start by viewing this not as one question, but as two questions. The question you put on the ballot effectively has two parts: 3.2 million for the operations of general government and 800,000 for the 0.8 million for the stabilization. The statutes treat the general fund, the general override separately. You can pass as much as you want, and you don't have to bring it in all at once. However, when you're passing money for the stabilization fund, and remember, even the appropriation process is different. Year 1, the town meeting appropriates it. Years 2 and all out years, it is the select board that acts as the appropriation authority. The override for the capital stabilization, both in its initial funding and in how it is subsequently appropriated, are dealt with separate and distinctly from the passage and the appropriation authority on the general override. I think that's where the confusion is.
Okay, well, let me read the passage directly from DLS. Okay, so it says, the additional funds raised by an override to fund a stabilization fund are earmarked for that purpose in the first fiscal year and in subsequent fiscal years upon appropriation. Any change in the purpose for which, I'm going to skip that part, it says in the first year, town meeting, town council or city council makes an appropriation into the fund of any amount up to the amount stated in the override. The community's levy limit is increased by the amount stated or amount appropriated if less. In subsequent years, the community's levy limit is increased only where the additional levy capacity is appropriated by a 2/3 vote of the selectmen, okay, town council or city council with the mayor's approval if required by law for the same stabilization fund purpose. If appropriated, the assessors raise the amount in the tax rate. And that's it. I've just read you the paragraphs. What am I missing?
Yes, and so if you appropriate 0, if there's no appropriation, the next year you can only go up by 2.5%, which is 0. So if you appropriated $100,000 because you wanted to bring this in over time, the next year you can only go up 2.5%, which is 102,500.
Right, but we could do 200,000 rather than 800,000.
You,
This is what I'm missing. Why do I have to do 800,000 this year?
so let's assume for a moment you bring in 200,000, okay? On Saturday, you say, let's bring in 200,000. Town meeting has made that appropriation. Next year, it is the select board that's the appropriation authority. They can only go up 2.5%. They can't say, well, we're gonna go up 2.5%, plus now we wanna bring in an extra 200,000. That is the rub.
And Carter, and I guess this is what I'm not understanding either. And again, I'm not, DOR counsel for the state, but we have a levy capacity in which we can raise and appropriate to, and then there's the limit in which we can compound whatever was raised and appropriated, correct? In this case, we're calling out that, hey, out of this 4 million, there's 800,000 that's being earmarked for capital projects. So I guess that what I'm hearing is that cities and towns cannot say, well, you know what, this year we need 250 of that. But the levy capacity is what we can put into it. Okay, so if our levy capacity is 4 million, what's preventing the town of Grafton from saying, we're going to forego 800,000 of that? Because we said 4 million in the ballot question. We're just earmarking. And I know you're saying it's two different questions, but I guess I'm just not following that. And again, I could be way off base here. But
part of it, I think, is that folks are not familiar with how the recap sheet is, and they're viewing the levy limit as a single number. It's actually not. First is the basic levy limit, which is your budget plus 2.5% plus your new growth, plus your general overrides. Then there's your debt exclusion portions. Then below all that is your overrides for stabilization funds. Each one is viewed separately and distinctly.
Sorry to jump in.
I'm sorry, 1 second. Go. We
I
had
need to
Dan.
leave.
I think we had Dan, you, and then Ed. Thank you. Yep.
Actually, I've been waiting for like a half an hour, but okay.
I'm sorry, Ed. I didn't see your hand up. I just saw. I'm paying attention to what's going on. My bad. Let's have Dan go first, then you, Ed, and then Gopal, please. Thank you.
I just want to say I found the IGR that we've been talking about, and it spells it out really clearly in an example. It's exactly how Ginny described it right before I told her that's not how it works. To me, it seems ridiculous, but it's exactly what she said. It specifically says, I mean, I could share my screen if you like, of the part that shows it. Let me find the right window. This one. All right. So yeah, it's so it shows that here in fiscal 19, 105,000 is available, but only 80,000 is appropriated. Then in fiscal 20, the amount available becomes 82,000, only increasing from that 80,000. It makes no sense to me why they would do it this way, why they would do it differently for a stabilization funded override versus a regular override. But that's what it says.
Okay. Ed?
Yeah, Ginny just indicated that she needs to leave, so I'm going to let her scoot in before me, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Thank you.
That wasn't me. I think that was Gopal who.
Gopal. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Gopal, go ahead.
He may have left. What he
Gopal
was to
Gopal already
tell us
left,
he was
guys.
leaving.
Yeah, hold on a minute, hold on. Gopal had to leave. He let me know, so he didn't get a chance to ask his question, but Carter, he may want to email you individually. All right, Ed, did you want to go there?
Yeah, so here's the deal. There are policy reasons why the legislature treats general operating overrides differently from stabilization funds and all that differently from debt exclusion overrides. We don't need to get into it. What we need to understand is, I read Ginny's memo. I think she's right. Obviously I'm frustrated that this wasn't a conversation that we had way back in February. This wasn't a spur of the moment decision to pass an override. This was something some of us were trying to talk about for 5 years. And then when it did happen, we had a $6 million number initially in January. Then COVID hit. Then we weren't sure if we were going to do it. And we had a Tri-Comm meeting. We were going back and forth about capital stabilization because there are people in town government and on elected boards and committees who understand that the more you put off capital, the more expensive it is in the long run. That is the golden rule of life. It is true for the roads. It's true for the library. It's true for the DPW facility. And, for all the people who are frustrated that we're spending money on capital, the idea is we're providing you a service in the cheapest way possible. And now we're left with the decision that we need to really rethink what, the purpose of this override. We could very well say, forget it. We told people we weren't going to raise $800,000 in year one. So let's not raise $800,000 in year one, and we'll try it again in the spring. And maybe from now on with overrides, we'll take the approach where they should be 2 questions. And maybe we should go to the voters and make the case to them that spending money on capital over time saves them money. That's one option that we have. I'm not sure I'm ready for that one. My question is, and someone actually Greg Marr emailed me with this just now, can you appropriate the $800,000 now and in year 2 cut people that break of not doing it at all?
I don't think so.
You cannot, because you're back to starting from the lower number that you've appropriated, which is you're back to 0.
So you're back to that 2.5% times 0, that whole thing.
Yep, and the IGR, this is the example that Dan brought up that is really quite on point. So if you had $800,000 this year and next year you said, well, we're going to cut it to 200 to give everybody a break. In year 3, you can only go up 2.5% of the 200,000. As we understand it, I want to be clear, as we understand it.
I mean, again, the frustrating thing is we're having to make this decision on the fly because we've got a set tax rate here, and this is coming up in 2 days.
Sorry, before we move on to Ed, did anyone else have their hand up in the past 20 minutes that may not have seen? Irene, I saw yours. I just want to make sure I call people. Okay, Irene, and then Colleen, please.
Okay, so I think I see where I might have gotten confused. I was looking as the 800,000 as a one-time amount we wanted to raise over 4 years. What I'm hearing is that, like the road stabilization, where we said, okay, look, roads aren't going away and they're not going to get fixed and be fixed forever. They continuously need, potholes filled and, repaving every so many years, et cetera. So if I'm hearing this correctly, what we did with that stabilization fund was say, look, our capital's not going anywhere. These buildings are here, okay? And they need roofs and they need windows and they need heating systems. We're gonna put $800,000 every year in perpetuity, okay? Just for sake of argument. And that's why we have to make it 800,000 this year to make sure we can do 800,000 next year and 800,000 in year 3. Is that where I made my mistake in thinking it was only 800,000 over 4 years total?
Ginny, do you want to take that one?
Excuse me. I'm not really sure about, what the plans were for incorporation. My understanding of it from June before town meeting was just given all the uncertainties of COVID, the board wanted to maintain, or the town wanted to maintain maximum flexibility to pass the override, but yet respect that people were in different positions with respect to the economy and job losses, et cetera. So, you know, quite honestly, I was not aware of the differing treatment of stabilization funds until Carter asked me this question. You know, it's just, I think it's just a, you know, very specific aspect of how Proposition 2.5 works, which is a very complicated law. So, you know, I just had never been presented with this question before, so I didn't realize. But, you know, the decisions of what's actually appropriate in year one are policy, not legal. So I don't think I was involved in that conversation. If I was, I don't recall what the intent was in terms of you know, how to bring in the 800,000 and when to do that.
Thank you. Ms. Roy and then Ms. Robbins.
So just to clarify, because we've touched on a lot of different subjects, we never created an $800,000 stabilization fund as we told voters we would. We made a $4 million general override fund, but, well, not fund, but general override when we told them it would be 3.2. We don't have the flexibility we told people we would with the $800,000 stabilization, even if we do create it. What flexibility could we possibly have using just the 4 million, leaving it the way we reported it? Where could we do like a $200,000 general fund transfer into the municipal capital stabilization account 1 year and then no transfer the next year? Or we've already decided that's not possible?
So first, I need to touch upon the phrase that you use. We were going to create a capital stabilization fund. I'm assumed for this entire conversation, shame on me, that in fact that fund exists, and all you're now doing is committing a specific revenue source to it.
You're correct. I'm sorry, I misspoke. We do have a municipal stabilization account, and it should have.
I just wanted to be clear, because if that hadn't been done, you got a much larger problem on your hands. Peter, do you have the access to the wording of the override question?
I do.
At all?
I've got it up. Hold on a second.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the question's clear. You passed an override for 4 million. But as far as the statute's concerned, you passed a combined question of 2 parts. And that's why DOR recommends you do these as separate questions. Because you passed an override for $800,000 for the municipal capital stabilization fund. You have great flexibility on the 3.2 million. You have no flexibility on the 0.8 million, as I read the statute, as Ms. Kramer's advised, as the IGR advises, and as your assessor advises. Now, that's and as counsel for DLS, the Division of Local Service, advised Ms. Kramer. I'm just not seeing a way out of this box, and I'm not saying I couldn't be wrong. I mean, we all can be wrong from time to time. But I'm just not seeing a lot of flexibility here if you want to preserve this $800,000. Now, with respect to a special town meeting, as Ms. Kramer suggests, yes, that would give us time to get the community to understand, but let's just talk timeline. The earliest you could do this is basically 21 days. You need a couple days to have the select board meet, approve the warrant. You have a particular provision in your charter relative to how long a warrant has to be open that I think you would run afoul of. Let's for a moment say you can get over that hurdle. you'd be December 1 before you had a special town meeting. Then you are really backing up the queue to get your tax rate approved. And the longer you wait to get the documents into DOR, the longer it takes them to turn it around. You can't get it out in the printers. And if you don't have that tax bill out postmarked by the last of the year, you cannot collect the February quarter, which creates cash flow, potential cash flow problems. I'm not sure that the timing of a special town meeting works to buy you more time.
Okay. Sue?
I just wanted to say that originally the 800,000 was to be in answer to Irene's question, is that the 800,000 was to be 800,000 a year, not over 4 years. Because what can you do with 200,000 for capitalization? Not much. So when we asked the town for this, we were asking the townspeople for 800,000 a year. And my understanding, which I understand from Carter, is that if we don't appropriate this 800,000 this year or on Saturday, we've lost it completely. And we'll have to go back and do another override. My only question, and I don't want to put this clinker in there, and Jeannie can answer this. If we put this 800,000 under Article 1, is that in the scope of the article?
Yes, excuse me, yes, because the article itself sets forth no specifics whatsoever. It's just an adjustment. Yeah.
It will change the vote that's required, however, wouldn't it, Ginny?
Yeah, it would have to be 2/3.
From majority to 2/3.
Yeah.
So Carter, Ginny,
Does it really?
I'm sorry?
Does it really change the requirement? It's 2/3 vote, Ginny?
Actually, the municipal, yeah,
That was majority.
yeah,
Yeah.
the municipal
Modernization. You're right, Jenny.
Yeah, changed it, yeah, to 50% in, 2/3 out. So, yeah, so it would still be 50%. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for that catch, Sue. I'm
okay.
Still adjusting my mind to some of the changes. My apologies again.
So I got a question here in terms of in our own levy capacity. Let's think about this. We have to do something with this 800,000 or we lose it in entirety. And the town voted to, to accept this. Is it possible to back down general fund appropriation by 800,000 in lieu of this $800,000 for capital stabilization? We transfer it into a capital stabilization account, but then in the Springtown meeting, we reappropriate it to whatever it is that we need to backfill from whatever we're taking. Just to throw it out there.
Once this money, you've created a stabilization fund for a very specific purpose. An override to fund that stabilization fund is only for that purpose. You cannot transfer the monies out for anything other than that purpose.
But we could potentially transfer free cash. Oh, wait a minute, Sue, hold on a minute. I'm just saying, like, what do we have at our disposal here? So what decisions can town meeting make, okay, to move monies around without having to add to the tax rate, if that's at all possible? Because I'll be honest with you, we talked about this and we're very open that we weren't going to, the intention was never to implement the 800,000 capital stabilization fund in year one, regardless of how this was written. That was always the intention. So I'm trying to figure out, is there other avenue for us in terms of accounting, and then what does town meeting have to decide? As crazy as it sounds.
It's not crazy, but it's not without risk. So please don't hold me to exact numbers, but you had about $1,350,000 of free cash certified. You're using some at the special town meeting, and for lack of a better number, let me just say you're using 100. You're using more than 100,000. Let's say you're going to be left with $1,000,001. Let me just use that number. for illustration purposes. So you cut the general support of the general budget from by 800,000. You use less tax levy and you use free cash, which gets you where you want to be, Peter. You've evened out the 800,000 in taxes you're raising for the capital stabilization fund by applying 800,000 in free cash to the operating budget. That brings you down to 300,000. And again, please don't hold me to a very exacting number here. The challenge is, will $300,000 cover your snow and ice deficits, any increased insurance costs, any backfills you have to do in your operating budget? And Madam Chairman of the Capital Committee, can you sustain 1 year without a capital investment, or limit yourself to a capital investment that is based upon withdrawing 800,000 from the capital stabilization account?
Have we confirmed the amount that was in the municipal capital stabilization account? I know I've asked a few times. I still don't have a confirmed amount. in there.
I'm sorry, I did not realize you'd ask that, and I will get that number. But that's what you would have to do, Peter, is you would have to either forego a capital program or support it by a withdrawal from the capital.
But I've got 800,000 in capital stabilization fund to fund capital projects.
Depending upon how you define the capital fund, if you define it for municipal buildings only, then you can only fund building projects. If you defined it just plain capital, you can only expend it on whatever you define that fund to be for.
Okay, thank you. Ed and then Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I understand where you're going with it, and I see what you're trying to do, and I appreciate the effort, but I think all the same, we're left with really two choices here. We're going to admit a mistake and deal with it, or we're going to let taxpayers off the hook this year and come back to them next year and say, again, we made a mistake, and we're asking you to make the same commitment you've already made to capital and lay out the reasons for people why they need to do that. And maybe they'll say no, but at least we'll have tried. And I would agree that probably if we let this go this year, you're not going to see that $800,000 next year. I don't think after a year of COVID, people are going to pony up for the theoretical, capital spending now saves money in the future. It's true. It's always true. It always will be true. But I think when push comes to shove, you're not going to make it. So I think the question tonight is whether or not the number is going to be $800,000 or whether we're going to live with another number south of $800,000. I still do, when I look at the IGR, I still do wonder about the year 2 of the IGR, but I think that's a discussion for another day because it doesn't matter. Unless you think that's going to sway an opinion about whether or not you want to appropriate $800,000 now. But I think the conversation now is either 800 now or some number south of there, just to preserve the fund and the idea behind the fund. Just my opinion.
Right. Mr. Austin?
Yeah, so I was headed in the same direction that Mr. Prisby was. I just did some quick math. If we decide to appropriate 600,000 this year and we raise that by 2.5%, it gets us about 10 years to get to that 800,000 number. So I think we need to respect the fact that we are in COVID, that there was a certain characterization of how this money would be raised and appropriated over time, but also that we have a growing backlog of capital projects every year that isn't going to go away. It's just going to get bigger, and it has been getting bigger over time. That's the trend. Our amount of certified free cash has gotten lower every year. That problem doesn't go away. So we've got to solve it one way or another. So I would advocate that we try to come to some compromise and respect the fact that we don't want to be increasing people's taxes more than we need to, but that we do have some structural finance issues that just need to be dealt with.
Okay, any other questions? Ms. Roy?
I know having a special town meeting on this wouldn't be ideal, but what about a public hearing just so people could give their feedback? Is that something we would even want to entertain?
There would be a public hearing, Colleen, for this anyways, right? If I'm not mistaken, with the finance committee. So they would have an opinion there. We could have one ourselves and it's nothing denying us from doing that. But I would agree that we would probably want to get public input. I don't know how the rest of the board feels, but yeah. Mr. Kusher.
So if we were to roll this into one of the articles for the town meeting that's coming up in 2 days, we wouldn't have a public hearing before then, right? Because we've already had public hearings for those articles.
It would become an added paragraph to Article 1.
Since there's your public hearing, right? It's the football field Saturday at whatever time we have to be there. Luckily, it's going to be warm.
Warmer. Sorry. Okay. Any other question? So Carter, when's the last possible day we need to set the tax rate?
You have to be able to get your bills postmarked by December 30, and everything works backwards from there. And just remember that the longer it goes, the more bills the printer's doing, and because you've got to be able to get DOR, DLS approval. The longer you wait to submit everything to them, they get backlogged. So you kind of work backwards from that. And anything, in my opinion, after around Thanksgiving really starts to become pretty hairy as to getting everything done in time.
Okay. So the sooner the better, I got that. But realistically, when do you think we'll have an opportunity?
We have everything in the can, if you will. Subject to this revision we have to make on the 4 million and get that reported separately. That's a different issue. We have everything prepared, ready to hit send, assuming that the town meeting passed everything on Saturday. We were prepared to send this thing out as early as Tuesday. We have to make a change based on the 30,000 for the HRA. We're going to have to look at amending the reporting of the vote, and then whatever changes y'all make. Truthfully, we're probably next week. That said, it doesn't mean we can't hold on to it. I'm just not sure you have enough time to get to a special town meeting in the first week of December and be comfortable you can get your tax bills out on time. I'm not saying it's not possible, just there's a level of comfort as everything compiles. The DOR only has so much staff, printer, etc.
So we have to add this 800,000 to Saturday on Article 1, is what I'm hearing.
You have to add the 800,000.
I'm sorry, that's a decision that needs to be made.
It's either that or you file special legislation or you try it again in the spring. Those are your three options as Ms. Kramer and I have discussed.
Okay, 1 second, Mr. Kusher, before. So from the board's perspective, because part of this lies solely on us. What's we've talked about this for a while now. I just want to know what's the general consensus here on next step, Mr. Prisby.
Well, first I want to say that I don't think this is solely on us. I think that there are reasons why you hire staff to advise you through these things. As counsel told us, and I'm a lawyer, she's a lawyer, there are arcane provisions of Proposition 2.5 that we rely on people to be able to explain to us because we don't do this full time. So no, this is the second time this year. The first time was with the strong chief provision that we found out, we couldn't even have a strong chief if we wanted to because we need to amend our charter. So anyway, my preference would not be to hold a second costly meeting, but to go to town meeting and explain to people what the situation is, that we're looking for a number that they've already voted for, and it turns out we have to do this year. That's the most straightforward solution is my preference.
All right. Ms. Roy, Mr. Often?
I agree with everything Mr. Prisby just said. I'm not psyched about it. I really wish this had come up, the months leading up to it, but it didn't. That ship sailed. I guess the only outside the box thinking I could have is special legislation does seem risky in the sense you have to get the governor on board and all of the possible pushback you might get, but you might get time. And I just don't know how long something like that would take. Would that help us or hurt us the time, allowing us to possibly do another meeting in the spring without doing it on the ballot kind of thing?
So the special legislation would effectively say, notwithstanding any general or special statute to the contrary, the town of Grafton may appropriate sums of money approved for their capital stabilization fund in the fiscal year for which it was approved or the subsequent fiscal year. Now, Ms. Kramer would, sort of wordsmith that into something that really makes sense. And then you would appropriate the money in its entirety next year. That's probably, if the legislature was willing to give you that kind of relief, and I think that that's risky because you're asking them to give you a pass, not on an administrative or procedural error. You're asking them to basically give you a pass on how the statute applies across the entire state. That is how something like that could be worded. And again, Ms. Kramer would have to work on, wordsmithing into something that, so you wouldn't be doing it. So if, let's say for a moment that passed, then next fall, you would appropriate the entire $800,000, assuming it took the legislature until the fall to approve this kind of legislation.
And if it didn't, it would just be done.
You're done, based upon our understanding of the statute and Ms. Kramer's conversation with DLS counsel.
All right, Mr. Often, I just want to get and Dan, I'll pivot right to you. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think, well, my feeling at the moment is we should roll into town meeting with an option. I'd like to talk about something a little bit less than 800 though, but I think we've got to appropriate something. I think that's the most straightforward thing to do. It's really unfortunate that the ballot question doesn't look like it was crafted in a way that really supported what the discussions and plan was. But here we are. So it's just a matter of, we're raising the tax rate a year earlier than we had planned on. But that's where I'm at.
Okay. So I would agree with Mr. Prisby and Ms. Roy on this one. Although I'm interested in exploring the idea of going for special legislation with the governor to buy us a year, which I think would keep in mind of what we were trying to do. To your point, it's risky. Do we take that risk knowing that, they could say no? And it's not as straightforward as what you were saying, Mr. Prisby, of course, and just dealing with it now. So, all right. Mr. Kusher? I'm sorry, Mr.
Sorry to jump in on you, Dan. How are we going to message this? How are we going to roll this out and explain this to residents how we got here?
Honesty. You just add paragraph D to the Article 1, and in presenting the motion, hopefully the moderator gives you a couple of moments to explain what it's all about, and you're just point blank honest and upfront. There's no mileage in trying to put any wax on it.
So we should try to address this before town meeting. We're going to wait till town meeting, and anyone else who just happens to be watching tonight kind of thing. You don't think we should?
I don't know how you get, you are folks who deal with this on a fairly regular basis. You've had the documents ahead of time, and look at the amount of time that it's taken everyone to kind of thrash it out. I don't know how between whatever decision point tonight and 9:30 a.m. Saturday morning, you have a conversation with the community. I just don't know how you do that.
Mr. Kusher.
So I just want to make sure I understand how the options interact with each other. If we go for it at Saturday's town meeting and it fails, could we try for the special legislation to put it in next year, as we kind of planned on, and then if that fails, could we come back at special town meeting in May with, some even lower amount? Or do any of these options prevent us from using other options?
So you go to your town meeting and you say, I want to appropriate 800,000, and it fails. So you file the special legislation. Now you're going to roll the dice on how that works. That's a judgment call. But as Ms. Kramer's pointed out, this needs to be appropriated before the tax rate is set. And in this state, you don't get to send out a supplemental tax bill. You don't get to say, oops, I'm sorry, we forgot this, so here's a supplementary bill. So no, you cannot appropriate it at the spring town meeting or at the annual town meeting. The sole exception would be if your special legislation passed, you could appropriate it at the annual town meeting for fiscal 22. It would not be for this fiscal year.
Right.
Okay. All right, Mr. Prisby.
Yeah, just to address Colleen's question, I think that the messaging is, we were trying to save taxpayers money in the long run by appropriating money to a capital stabilization fund. We thought in doing that, we could, in light of COVID, cut taxpayers a break by not raising and appropriating this based on information that we received from staff. We were wrong, they were wrong, and now here we are. We're coming to you with an amount that we still think will save you money over the long term. But unfortunately, we have to raise and appropriate something now, and this number is the something we came to. And I think the question becomes, what's that number? I think, I don't know, I don't remember if Matt had mentioned 600,000, but that sounds closer to where my head's at than certainly 8. Reasonable minds can differ.
Mr. Often.
Yeah, so 600 was the number that I came up to. If we increase that by 2.5 each year, it takes us about a decade to get up to that 8. Certainly we have some money in the current capital stabilization account. I think that was there already. And we got some from the super park as well. So that will sort of augment, if we're not appropriating the full 800, that'll get us a year or two of something that approximates that level of funding for capital. So I feel like that's a pretty good compromise. Just trying to respect, the fact that we're also raising an additional amount for the other levy.
So is it the idea that the board will go forward with a number, whether it be 600 or 800,000 on Saturday, to be part of Article 1, and then we would need to reset the tax rate based on the outcome of that article at town meeting, right? So
The 1696, Mr. Chairman, assumed that everything that was in your warrant passed. So that additional $230,000 in Article 1 was already in that 1696. So the 1696, if you went for 800, is $17.25, a 28-cent increase, or roughly about 3.5 cents per $100,000 of appropriation.
Does that include the additional 30,000 you just added to Article 1 earlier?
You don't have any appropriation left to do that. I didn't want to eat into your levy limit for that 30,000. So I'm using free cash to cover that 30,000 so that the tax rate didn't move, Colin. Because remember, Article 1 has a lot of one-time hits this year that you won't have next year. So that's why I was just doing it with free cash, because that 230 will become tax levy available to you next year.
excuse me for one moment. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jeannie, I understand that you had a commitment that you need to be getting to, but I wanted to just make sure we don't need her. I think we've gotten the legal opinion on what the situation is, but I just wanted to ask the select board if there was any questions that they had for Ginny before she needed to leave. You're all set. Thank you, Ginny, very much. I appreciate you making the time.
Rejoining my school committee Zoom. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, so given what Carter had just said, so what's the wish of the board going for Saturday? I heard 600,000. I hate to be like an auctioneer. I mean, but
Going once.
yeah.
I think that's fair. I mean, it's more than certainly, and I don't know what that would get the tax rate to. I'm assuming it would be somewhere around $17, which is a tough pill to swallow. But at the same time, we have needs that this money was to address, and we did the capital stabilization portion of this deliberately because of those needs. As I say to people who complain about their taxes and their road, you can have one or the other, but you can't have both. You can get the road and pay the money, or you can not pay the money, but you're not going to get the road. And that is the unfortunate reality of local politics. The buck stops here, and there is no deficit spending. The money that comes in is the money that goes out. So I would be okay with an ask of 600. And hey, if we get pushed back at town meeting floor, maybe we talk about another number, but I think that's where we start.
Okay. Ms. Roy, Mr. Often, is that something we want to go forward with on Saturday? Okay. Carter, did you have a question?
The tax rate at 600,000 would be approximately $17.18 Might be $17.17, but within a penny or two of that. So you'd go from 17.25 down to that 17.17, 17.18.
All right, so I think if we decide that, we're gonna have to have that information for Saturday, Carter, and available.
Yeah, once we know what the board's pleasure is, we can get that, whether it's, so I'm not within a penny or two, but I'm spot on.
Okay, so does anyone want to make a motion to reduce from 800,000 to 600,000 to be considered for town meeting?
I move the board vote to consider, I'm sorry, what did you say? Move the board vote to consider 600,000 instead of 800,000 for the capital stabilization account at town meeting.
Second.
Okay, motion made and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? So just for clarification, the idea of this motion is to give everyone, idea that we're going to come in with a lesser number than what was originally proposed last June for the ballot question. In addition to that, we will have data available at the Saturday that will reflect what the changes are. All right, just want to make sure I said that for the motion. Is there any other input from the board for this motion or discussion? Hearing none. All those by roll call, please. Mr. Prisby.
Frisbee, aye.
Ms. Roy.
Roy, aye.
Mr. Often.
Often aye.
Peter Carlson, no. I declare the motion carried 3-4. Okay. All right. So we've got that wrapped up for you, Carter. We got a direction for Saturday. Is there anything else we need to discuss about that, or do we want to move on next to the road stabilization?
I think we pretty well wrapped that up.
I agree. I'm sorry, Ms. Wool?
I just want to add something about the HRA, just for Carter's information and also for everybody else. One of the things I did was I went back through the fiscal year 20 budget. Carter, there is no line item for the HRA. And I went back to the fiscal year 19 budget, and there's no line item for the HRA. And I went through the budget line by line. It's not there. So when you're planning for the 22 budget, decide where that needs to go and create the line item for us, because none of us knew about it because it doesn't exist.
Well, maybe the board won't re-up me at their November 17th meeting. I have a conservative approach to budgeting. I hope I can bring you, I hope they do re-up me, and I hope I can bring you a budget that meets with your approval.
To be fair, Barry Smith is always the one that is on us about what is in that line item.
Yeah.
And it got to a point a couple of years ago, I started rolling my eyes. I was like, God, Barry, stop asking that question. But here we are with having this conversation. So that's something, Barry, you've got gloating rights over that henceforth.
Never mind.
All right. So we're going to move on here to road stabilization. So tonight, asking the board to vote instruct the Board of Assessors to raise 1.5 million for the road stabilization account. So for this one, just so I'm clear, Carter, that the current tax rate, which we've already decided on, is anticipating this 1.5 million to be
That is correct.
appropriated, right? So that doesn't go into what we just discussed for the past hour on the capital.
No, the 1696, the 1718, whichever happens, is inclusive of this 1.5 million.
Okay. Mr. Often.
Yeah, and I just want to be crystal clear. So Mr. Terenzini, I think I understood it that you said if we raise the 1.5 this year, we could consider next year raising that by 2.5%.
That in fact had been my plan, Mr. Often, until I discovered the hiccup on this other issue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we need a vote from the board tonight to be put into the record for this. So the Board of Assessor Board of Assessors can move forward with this. So if there isn't any other discussion, this is pretty straightforward. I can entertain a motion unless there's any other questions from the select board.
So what about reducing this by to 2.5% now? So it looks like, you know, the idea that we're trying to save money everywhere we can. Is that even worth it or no?
You are then trapped at the lower level and you start moving back up. So that becomes a policy decision for this board. At 1.5 million plus your grants, plus your Chapter 90, you're barely treading water.
Okay.
All right, I move the board vote to instruct the assessor to raise 1.5 million for the road stabilization account.
Motion made and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Carter, just so we're knowing, is this for FY21 or FY22?
My understanding of the way you do this is that this is for FY21.
Thank you. Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? All right, hearing none by roll call, please. Mr. Frisbee?
Frisbee, aye.
Ms. Roy?
Roy, aye.
Mr. Often?
Often aye.
Carlson, aye. Okay, declare the motion carried 4-0. Thank you. All right, that concludes the agenda for this evening. I want to thank the Finance Committee, and again, I want to thank the school committee who was here earlier, Dr. Cummings, Finance Director Anita Patel, for making out. Carter, thank you very much for preparing this and getting this caught. I guess through fate, there was a reason why town meeting was postponed last weekend, because I don't know what we would have done if we had had town meeting last week and we came to these issues on Tuesday. So I want to say we consider ourselves fortunate by luck of weather, but at least we'll be in a nice warmer day this Saturday, to Mr. Prisby's point. But I also want to thank Sue for putting together the logistics on this and getting this out to everybody. If there isn't anything else that we need to cover tonight, I am satisfied with the agenda. I can entertain a motion from the select board to adjourn. And Irene, if you want to take a motion from your.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I'll take a motion from Finance Committee.
Chair, before we do that, there is something I do want to say. It's a little bit off topic, but I think pertinent to tonight. Before COVID, before all our meetings, we stood and said the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And we hadn't been doing that, but the reason we had been doing it before was because we wanted to acknowledge, you know, we are all here as representatives of the democracy. And we thought it was fair to acknowledge, I think, love of country and respect for what we do. The President of the United States went on television shortly before we met tonight and assailed the integrity of a lot of people in the country who have been counting ballots fairly, and I think accused them of fraud without any justification, reason, or evidence. I did want to point out, you know, we had an issue with our ballot counting system this past June. That was simple human error. You know, we've taken steps, I think, to address that issue. And I wanted to have somebody thank publicly and on television the people, the poll workers, and the people in the clerk's office, who I know have been pulling extra duty because they've been short-staffed, for doing a phenomenal job under the circumstances, counting all the ballots, you know, making sure everybody was safe during a pandemic. Really, you know, it's thankless work. So much of this is all thankless work. And I really think that it would behoove us to take a moment just to thank them and acknowledge that we appreciate what they do. So thank you to the poll workers. Thank you to everybody in the clerk's office for making this run as smoothly as humanly possible this week.
I couldn't agree more, Mr. Prisby. And just to kind of let you know, there were over 11,000 ballots cast in Grafton. Phenomenal turnout, phenomenal number. You're absolutely right. It takes a lot of work to process 11,000 votes, and they did a fantastic job. So yes, they are due our gratitude and this town's thanks for their job and putting themselves at risk, you know, during a pandemic. But talk about the love of country and the love of our town. There it is right there. Right. So People like the people who work in the polls and doing this. They're not doing it for the money, trust me. They're doing it because they love it. Okay, thank you for that, Ed. So if you want to go ahead and adjourn Finance Committee, we can.
Yeah. So who wants to make a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Robbins makes a motion to adjourn
Second,
Second,
and Barry Smith seconds. Okay, by roll call vote, Heather McHugh,
McHugh, aye.
Sue Robbins,
Aye.
Barry Smith,
Barry Smith, aye.
Dan Kusher.
Kusher, aye.
Okay, Andy Jefferson,
Jefferson, aye.
Irene Hool, aye. Motion carries. We're adjourned.
Thank you. Okay, enter a motion from the select board to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
Motion made, seconded. By roll call, please. Mr. Frisbee,
Frisbee, aye.
Ms. Roy,
Roy, aye.
Mr. Often,
After night.
Carlson, I. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening. We'll see you on Saturday.